Good evening. My name is Menina Jones, and I'm Chair of English and Writing Studies at Western University. Like today's featured writer, Emma Donoghue, I address you from London, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous communities whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. It may feel a bit odd to give a land acknowledgement in this virtual form, but I would encourage everyone to take solo writer Lee Miracle's advice. The land is there, she says. It's alive and it's all around you. The spiritual, ecological, and historical world is all around you, everywhere, all the time. So you might as well say hello. It is a great privilege today to welcome Emma Donoghue. Born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, she holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, as well as an honorary doctorate from Western. She's a longtime resident of London, Ontario, where she and her family currently reside. Emma began composing poetry somewhere about the age of 10, and from what I can tell, has been writing literary scholarship, poetry, novels, short stories, radio drama, children's fiction, plays, film and television screenplays, essays, pretty much nonstop ever since. She has done so to considerable acclaim. Her fiction ranges not just in genre and style, but from contemporary settings to the historical, as in her recent novel, The Pull of the Stars. Based on her highly regarded novel Room, Emma Donoghue wrote the screenplay for the film of the same name, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Tragically, the play she adapted from her novel for the Grand Theatre here in London, Ontario, was cancelled on its opening night due to COVID-19. As we all went into lockdown in March, the story of Room took on new dimensions. In describing the forced imprisonment of a young mother and her 5-year-old son, Jack, in a tiny single space, Emma Donoghue named our feelings of isolation, loneliness, and confinement. But Room also vividly portrayed the power of the imagination to exceed such limitations, showing us how play and creativity through books, drama, the arts, have the power to connect us and keep us going during difficult times. With that essential principle in mind, I'd like to extend warm thanks to the London Public Library and the organizers of WordsFest for supporting and celebrating the arts and creating community even when we're physically separated. That's something to celebrate. Emma Donoghue's most recent novel, The Pull of the Stars, now an international bestseller, takes place over 3 days in an understaffed hospital in Dublin, Ireland, during the height of the Great Flu pandemic of 1918. In a tiny closet of a makeshift ward, Nurse Julia Power, with the aid of Bridie Sweeney, a young volunteer who turns up seemingly out of nowhere to help her, tends to expectant mothers who have contracted the flu and who must experience their confinement in the confinement of quarantine, because the flu makes them and their babies vulnerable to life-threatening complications. The novel was conceived in 2018 when COVID didn't even exist. Submitted to the publisher in March 2020, just before the recent pandemic began, this novel has been called spooky, prescient, and uncanny, but I like to think of it as timely. So I thought I might begin by asking Emma to talk about the timeliness of her novel. First, Emma, welcome. Can you say something about how fiction about the past sometimes really hits nerves with present-day audiences?
Sure. Thanks, Menina, and thanks so much to WordsFest for having me back. And London Public Library, can I just give a little shout out? London Public Library no longer charges fines. Could there be a more concrete way to make libraries accessible to all, to make everyone feel welcome there? So well done. In the middle of a pandemic, what a wonderful move. Anyway, yes, to answer your question, I think historical fiction, if it's done well enough, will always have things to say about today. And I don't think that means that you have to approach it in a spirit of, oh, how can I comment on today in direct forms? It's more that if you go really all in on any era in the past, and if you pay close enough attention, you're likely to say something lastingly true. So in this case, everything I wrote was about the Great Flu of 1918 and not about COVID, because really I'd signed off on the book by the time COVID came along. But it seems that, the same things happen in every era, not only the basic, terror of the outsider, vague fears about how you might catch this invisible germ, but also things like politicians blaming the victims, people both desperately wanting to help each other and being afraid of each other. Those same things play themselves out. So I've always found that if you approach the past with, the concerns of today, even if your novel scrupulously avoids anachronism, you are going to end up saying something which is relevant to today. And in this case, it was just that the timing was almost alarming to me, because I really didn't intend any connection, and the book wasn't even meant to be published until next year. But just as so many writers found their publication put off, suddenly I was getting a call from my publishers to say, "Can we bring it out in July?" I didn't even know big literary publishers could work that fast, because usually they assure you that they need at least a year for everything. It's kind of funny to see that they can absolutely, fling all the skilled people together to, really beautifully copy, edit, and design, and bring out a book. And my American publishers, even, they got me the copy editor I had on The Wonder, who was an emergency room doctor as well. So she was literally going between COVID patients and my text. So I really felt this obligation to get the medical stuff right with her help. And I also had a wonderful midwife in Hamilton who I consulted on all the midwifery in the book. And again, she was quarantined due to COVID. And so I was getting this, absolutely fresh from the cold face medical advice from two people to try and make sure the novel would be as true as possible.
Did you actually make any revisions to the book in the process of it coming out after you'd submitted it to sort of reinforce any of those connections with the present moment?
The only thing I remember is that I had deliberately not used the word pandemic in my novel, because even though that was the correct word, it didn't sound very 1918. It sounded very sciencey and jargony. And so I thought my impression was that most people would have just called it, the flu or an epidemic. So I said epidemic. But suddenly in April, pandemic was an absolutely normalized word. It was one of our bits of new jargon that everyone was using. So I thought, oh, actually, I can afford to say pandemic. That's all I remember changing. I didn't need to add anything to make it relevant to today, and it would have been, a fairly crass thing to do, because the novel was trying to be so true to 1918. So no, I just tried to make it as true as possible, and really correct any remaining medical errors of mine. I don't have a science background at all, and I'd worked desperately hard to try and be accurate both about the birth process and about the flu. And in some cases, I even sort of used my own confusion. I remember, looking between my notes on what a particular patient of Julia's, what her flu would be doing to her blood pressure. And then I was looking at what her pregnancy would be doing to her blood pressure. And I was thinking, should Julia put her with her head high or with her feet high? And then I thought, I can use this confusion. Even Julia will be confused at this point. So I actually wrote a little paragraph where she's like, legs up, head up, where do I put her? So no, I didn't sort of COVID it up at all. Already it was just weirdly similar. But I think the same would be true perhaps of any novel which pays really close attention to healthcare workers during a pandemic.
You were saying that you consulted with medical experts and talked to people in the course of writing the book, but there's also an awful lot of historical research there. Where did you go to do that, and what kinds of sources did you consult? It almost, the medical stuff almost feels like you got a medical degree to write this. But how did you find, and also the historical information? So what kind of research did you do, and then how did you find a way of integrating that into the plot?
Well, as a kind of not so much a lapsed academic, but I was planning to be a prof, and then I, went off those rails and onto the fiction rails instead. But it means I always like to give a shout out to the many academic researchers, and in particular historians, who novelists draw on. It's, people often have the impression that we're off in archives looking at primary sources and we're the first to dig something up. Not a bit. During the pandemic, I was ordering up, no, even before the pandemic, sorry, I was ordering up obscure books on, the training of midwifery students in Ireland in the 1890s. Exactly what advice there would be for breastfeeding women in 1910, that kind of book from the time, but also a lot of very specific histories of the flu. I'm thinking of ones like, say, Nancy Bristow's book, American Pandemic. And I read about the flu from all over the world, really, because I was trying to to gather those insights into how it played out in many different countries. And I started keeping a file on what governments in each country said to their population, because the details may have varied, but the same basic principles came up of governments giving false reassurance to try and keep the economy ticking along, or keep morale up in the case of the countries that were at war. The very reason they call it Spanish flu, that's basically like Wuhan virus, but it was a bit of propaganda language that stuck. It was never Spanish, and the Spanish were just open about the fact that the flu was running through their government because they weren't in the war. All the countries fighting the war were like, don't call it English, don't call it German. So the flu seems to have originated in Kansas, in fact. So yeah, I was very interested in the way government information signage and so on would basically try and dampen down fear, but also often implied that really it was your personal responsibility not to catch this. It would say something like, defeatism lets in disease, would imply that it was your weak mind that was somehow letting the germs through, or your failure to access sunshine, for instance. There'd be signs saying, seek out fresh air and sunshine. And I'd have been looking at, pictures of the Dublin slums and the damp wallpaper peeling off the walls. And I would think, where are they meant to find fresh air and sunshine in a Dublin November, So yeah, I found that the sources were absolutely fascinating. And I used the work of so many different historians to access those. So I always end up with too long a bibliography to possibly be able to credit everyone. But I know myself, because I've done academic research too, so I know how kind of unappreciated that is. You have to just do it for the sheer pleasure and satisfaction of getting all the little details right. But as a novelist, I always feel deeply grateful to those who've really put in the time in the archives, so that someone like me can kind of sweep in and say, oh, show me what medical training was like in the 1910s.
The propaganda finds its way in this kind of direct way. It's quoted in the text, almost as if we see the posters announcing all of these slogans and pieces of advice. Eat an onion a day. If you feel ill, have yourself taken care of for 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's another bit of advice that sounds like it's only relevant to duchesses, doesn't it? Yeah. And so often in recent months, I've seen the government say something like, make sure to work from home. And I'm thinking, oh, great, how is that possibly relevant to the guy who's delivering groceries, So yeah, I all those bits of government advice in the book, none of them are direct quotes, but they're all based on lots of government advice from different countries. And I was trying to kind of capture the surreal feel of it, these kind of smug slogans, often rhyming, for instance, where they would put them in very sort of snappy phrasing, and they were so, irrelevant to the reality of actually, pushing your way onto the tram and living cheek by jowl with people, or possibly trying to keep yourself safe while working in a hospital. So I found my fictionalized government advice posters a very good kind of punctuation device, because they're so different from the actual flavor of daily life during a pandemic.
One of the things that struck me about them is that it almost feels like you're passing the posters. And I was thinking about the way you've integrated so much historical and medical detail. But there's a lot there that had to come really out of your imagination. And one of the things that impressed me so much about The Pull of the Stars is the ways in which it has the texture of the time, that sense of being in the place. And that's partly because of smells and tastes and sounds that you hear in the background. And I'm just wondering how you go about getting yourself in that mindset.
I suppose I tend to use a single point of view. It might occasionally in a book move to somebody else, but it's always one person's point of view. I'm never the omniscient narrator. I've even tried things as omniscient narrator, and after about 2 pages, I'm like, I call BS on this. I don't believe in this floating camera. Much as I enjoy, say, the novels of Dickens, I need to be in somebody's head. I need to be in somebody's skin and smelling what they smell. So once I have a protagonist like, say, Julia Power, and I decide, okay, I'm going to work and I'm on the tram, I'm really sort of shutting my eyes and thinking, okay, how much are the other passengers squeezing close to me? And, oh, I'm smelling eucalyptus from somebody's collar because they're hoping that smell will ward off the invisible germs. I try and really, really inhabit their skin, especially with this novel being about a pandemic in the middle of a global war. I knew there was a real danger that if I tried to take on too much, it would get too thin. I don't really have an epic imagination. I like to go in close. And in particular with this one, I really sort of said to myself, I refuse to feel obliged to describe World War One plus what the pandemic was like worldwide. I refuse to give those statistics. I'm going to go in really close and give you just 3 days in one small ward, because I feel if I do that intensely enough that you will feel you have lived through the entire pandemic. But I needed to commit to just sort of one time and place, and just a cluster of patients. I suppose in a way, in the same way as a nurse or a doctor or a midwife, they can't heal everybody. They have to just work desperately hard to save the life in front of them. That's not the same as being a public health expert. They have to just commit to the person sick right in front of them.
It's interesting. When I started to read the novel, I knew about World War One. I knew about the Spanish flu epidemic, and I knew about the Irish Rebellion, but I never imagined that there was one place in which they all happened at the same time. And taking us into that world is just tremendously engaging and invigorating. And as you said, you're in there, you're in that world from the point of view of a single person experiencing it. I was thinking at one point, I think it's on your website, you comment that when you did revisions for Slammerkin, your editor said more London. Give me more of the feel of the place. And I really got the feel of the place in Dublin at that particular time. And
well, one reason I chose Dublin, I could have set this novel anywhere. My kind of hook was the fact I came across that women in late pregnancy were the most liable to catch the flu and have terrible side effects. I thought that was very interesting because they would have such complicated medical stories. Each of them would have sort of 2 different medical dramas running simultaneously, and the birth might go well and the flu badly, or vice versa. And birth is in itself so wonderfully unpredictable. I don't know why people don't write about birth all the time, because it's fascinating. It's not even an illness, but it can kill you. It's such a mixture of potential, happiness and horror, or sometimes the two muddled in together. But anyway, yes, I could have chosen a maternity ward anywhere, but I thought, okay, I'll go for Dublin because it's my hometown and I think I can make the voice convincing. But also I knew that Ireland had been through such a political upheaval in those years. I mean, very roughly in 1916, when we had this mini revolution for 6 days in Dublin, most people were opposed to it. Most people would have seen this as like really either nonsense or terrorism. And 10 years later, we had a free country. We'd broken away from British rule. So people went through such a political transformation in that time. And I thought, that would just add to the sense of like, the old order is falling apart. The status quo has shattered. Everything's up for grabs. I'm going to snatch a question from the Q&A as I see it, because it's so relevant to this. Sherry, or
sure, go ahead.
Sherry Stewart, why did you make Julia's brother non-verbal? Okay, this was one example of how it's not that I could ignore World War One, but I had to keep myself rooted in Julia's 3 days in her ward. But I thought if her brother was a war veteran, that would be a lovely way to evoke this grand drama, which, as you say, Menina, we tend to think of these as separate topics, as if they are successive items on a timeline, when in fact, history overlaps. It's all very messy. So I thought, okay, Julia's brother, I wanted her to live, I didn't want her to be married, but I didn't want her to live with a big gaggle of nurses in a lodging house either, because I wanted her to have and us to have a break from the hospital. So I thought she could live with her brother, and if he's a war veteran, that will evoke all that damage done. And I thought, do I give him, a scarred face or a missing leg or something? But then I thought, oh, if he's mute, that would be a lovely way of suggesting the damage. He looks fine, but something is deeply hurt in him. Something is deeply damaged. And he can't explain it. He won't explain it. Julia has to deduce it. So I thought it was a lovely way to talk quite subtly about mental harm, rather than if he's, say, lying awake having screaming nightmares or being violent or anything. It keeps it wonderfully implicit. And it was a nice challenge for myself as a character to sort of bring him to life without him saying a word. And like pre-verbal children, he's very evocative. He's actually a terribly caring and able person. He grows vegetables on the allotment and makes dinner and keeps it warm for her, and he tends a magpie. So he does a lot of things without saying a word. So Tim ended up as one of my favorite characters.
I think Catherine Leggett in the questions was asking about the character of Kathleen Lynn, who is one character that you have actually kind of pulled out of the historical materials and fleshed out as a character in the book. Can you talk a bit about her?
Sure. I mean, those who've read some of my books will know that I quite often use historical characters or incidents, but I would usually distinguish between my books that are fictional and my books that are sort of fact-inspired fiction. And this one was going to be purely fictional because I thought the pandemic, with the background of the war, was more than enough fact for me to be pinned to. Because every fact is, it's a bit of an effort to have to honor the facts of a life, for instance. So in this case, I wanted to be absolutely free to make up my characters. So I'm, made up Julia and Bridie to serve the story and all the patients. But I just wanted some background on Irish doctors of the time. And as soon as I started looking into Irish doctors, who should I find but Kathleen Lynn, who I couldn't have made up, in that I needed a doctor who would be brought in as a locum just temporarily to this hospital, an outsider. So I find this doctor who was not employed full-time by any Irish hospital because the men didn't want to work with a woman. And she had qualifications in midwifery. She was running her own flu clinic on the side, sponsored by her lifelong woman partner. She was a suffragist, she was a labor rights activist, and she had fought in the 1916 Rising, had gone to jail for it, and was on the run from police during the few weeks during that period in which my novel is set. So you can see I couldn't resist her, And I thought she would have this ability to sort of deduce the political meaning from what she's looking at. Julia is so close up doing the nursing. She can't be stepping back and saying, well, an interesting conclusion that I draw is, and Julia wouldn't be likely to have the same kind of intellectual sweep, but Dr. Lynn would. And so I thought she would be a huge addition to the book. But at first I tried to keep her fictional. I thought I don't want to have to bring in all that revolutionary politics. It's all too complicated. So I'll just give her a fictional name and I'll kind of minimize her contributions to the book. But my agents and my editors all said, tell us more about this doctor, So I found myself not only giving her true name, but also allowing her to speak more about politics and to start kind of converting Julia. I mean, in the first draft, Julia just says, oh, I don't have any time for politics. I was trying in a way to honor Julia's sort of feminist commitment to keeping these women alive and not let her think about any other politics. But my American agent said to me, we're living in the era of Trump, Emma. You either write an escapist bit of fluffy fiction or you write fiction that takes politics seriously, but you can't do something halfway. So she said, your novel is in fact very political. So you have to allow Julia to start noticing this. So that's a good example of how, I'm a big planner and I do a huge amount of thinking in advance, but I don't always see what in my book needs to change. So I hugely appreciate the early input of my 2 agents and 3 editors. It's kind of like an early focus group. So when they ask me for more of something, whether it's give us more 18th century London or give us more Kathleen Lynn, I tend to listen.
I wanted to ask. So we've met in our conversation thus far. We've talked a little bit about Julia and Kathleen. Can you tell us something about Bridie?
Sure. It's really a novel of 3 women because I didn't want it to be just a kind of binary of, here are 2 women so different. So I thought 3 would be interesting, and it would be a kind of a spectrum of power and status in the hospital, from a doctor who, okay, she may be, gossiped about and on the run from police, but she's still a doctor, through a nurse midwife who would have been relatively subordinate in the hospital hierarchy. And only the fact that the hospital is crazily understaffed at the point when I'm writing, that gives Julia quite a lot of authority that she wouldn't usually have had. And then I thought I want to complete nobody as well, because well, haven't we seen this year how important all those people working in hospitals are? It's the person who cleans the floor, the person who brings the food in. It's all a crucial part of that kind of net in which we are held when we're hospitalized. So I thought I want a helper, a nobody. And this was partly because when I was, I had elaborate notes on all Julia's tasks, and some of them I thought she just couldn't possibly do single-handed, even if it's only a 3-bed ward, like changing the bedclothes. So I thought she needs a helper, and I want that helper to have, as little status as possible, as little education as possible. And because then that helper will be a complete newbie who doesn't know anything about this world of early 20th century medicine and who will need everything explained. So an outsider character is always very, very useful to the reader, frankly, because the reader doesn't know about, asepsis and so on. So yeah, Bridie comes in with, in a way, no training, nothing to equip her for this, except lots and lots of natural talents, natural intelligence, curiosity, human warmth. And if, by being there at the right time in the right place, she is hugely useful to Julia and to the women on the ward. And she blooms because she's finding that she has interesting and useful work. Quite a few nurses and volunteers from the 1918 pandemic, they said afterwards that this was like the best time of their lives. I think so many women were underutilized then, or just sort of stuck at home, and so to find themselves actually saving lives when so many of the men were away, it was a huge thrill to them. It was grueling work, but a big thrill too. So I liked the idea that that the Bridie would in fact find it absolutely thrilling to be granted such useful work, and that in this intense room, Bridie and Julia and Dr. Lynn would all get to know each other very fast, and a real intensity would build up really as quickly as possible. I suppose I was asking myself whether human connection could grow as fast as a virus, whether the whole thing could happen in 3 days. I had a kind of either a viral timetable, or you could say kind of a childbirth timetable for everything in this book. Can I change all these lives in 3 days?
Yeah, Bridie kind of lights up the story when she comes in. I think partly because she thinks of this as an adventure. It's all a kind of a learning experience for her. I have a question from the questions on the connection between Room and The Pool of the Stars, and the fact that they both take place in very restricted spaces. The wardroom in The Pool of the Stars is an improvised wardroom because they need somewhere to put the women who are expecting children. And a lot of the drama takes place in that. It doesn't exclusively take place in that space. So is there a metaphor there?
Yeah, and I would say also my novel, The Wonder, much of that happens in one little room where a girl is sick in bed because she's been trying to live without food. So those three, they each do have a single key room. Sometimes I feel a little sheepish when I spot these repetitions, but then I think artists do this all the time. They're allowed their obsessions. Sometimes it takes more than one book to work something out. And I think the obsession with the single room, it's partly simply as a literary technique, it works. It's like the Agatha Christie locked room murder mystery. I absolutely love the intensity that builds up between people when you trap them together. And I tend to limit their time as well. I think of it as the unities of time, space, and action. That just where a story might easily get too diffuse or stretched out. If you limit it, if you make it all happen in half an hour in one room, it's likely to benefit. But also, I'm very interested in the history of women, and women's history has mostly been a matter of confinement, whether in the sense of giving birth or being stuck at home. And I can think of so many different situations, from girls not allowed to go to school under the Taliban, to Greek villages I've been in where you don't see any women. It's as if they've all died out, but no, they're at home making the dinner, So many different settings in which women's lives have been too circumscribed and too domesticated. So I suppose when you start looking at women's lives, the question of whether to kind of stay in the room or what chance you have of getting out of the room just does naturally arise. And in the case of room, I would say that the room was also a metaphor for the womb. There was kind of a pun that was built into that story from the start, and the idea of like the mother as the safe small place, and then you have to burst out into the wider world. By the way, I'm going to spot one question from Kirsten Smith. She says that horrific first delivery, was it based on real events? Yes, my own. I not only put in a few births of friends of mine into this book, but our first birth went great, except afterwards there was just one little difficulty. You may not have wanted to know these details, but the placenta wouldn't come out. So suddenly Dr. Usher, a local gynecologist, rushed in and basically got it out with her hands in 5 minutes. And I realized afterwards, oh my God, that's the moment where I feel my privilege. That's the moment where I would have died if I was living either in a previous century or in a place on this earth where you don't have access to good medical care. This is the moment where my life diverges from all those less lucky lives. Childbirth is the thing that routinely killed so many of our ancestors. So I've never felt quite so lucky to have had access to healthcare. And so I saved that memory for 16 years, and then I popped it into this book, but from the point of view of the midwife. And yeah, there's a peculiar satisfaction to using autobiographical material, but from a very different point of view. For instance, my last book, Akin, was all about the years in Nice that Chris and I have been lucky to spend because of Western's French exchange in Nice. But I gave all my thoughts to a 79-year-old man, so it's really fun to kind of revisit your own life stuff, but from a different angle. You know?
It's such a you were talking about the single room, and it's such an intimate, like anybody who has children has birth stories, and you've managed to sort of weave a whole bunch of them into this, but they're such intimate stories. What was it like to translate them into a sort of a more public form of storytelling?
I really enjoyed it because, I think birth is so typically glossed over, or if you see it on TV, it lasts maybe 30 seconds. It's always so dramatic, the water is bursting all over the carpet, the sudden kind of keeling over in agony, it's always the most high speed form, and then one kind of, and then beautiful baby. And I wanted to capture the way it's a slog, it's an effort. I have friends who spent 3 days kind of walking around town waiting for those contractions to strengthen, and it's also unpredictable in its ups and downs. So in a way, when I was planning the book, I basically thought, oh, I want a birth in there that's way too fast and scary. And I want a birth that's way too slow and exhausting. And I want one that seems to go beautifully, but then there's one bad outcome. And I want a birth that seems to go horribly, but then everybody's fine. So I wanted to capture the sheer narrative twists of birth. And above all, just honor not only the midwives, but the women who do this extraordinary thing. I'm not somebody who's ever done anything physically brave, but I have to say, birth for me was like, it sort of stands out like, doing a marathon. It's like these two extraordinary days in my life when I did something I never thought I'd be capable of. So I just wanted to honor the messiness, and the kind of, the unpredictability and heroism involved in getting the babies out. I see another interesting question about boy babies being weaker. Yes, I think that's a fairly well-known fact. But what's much less often talked about was that the flu had such a peculiarly awful effect on women in late pregnancy, and also women just a few weeks after birth too quite often died of that 1918 flu, which we would now understand in terms of like an immune system response. But that was one of those many medical concepts they just didn't have back then. I mean, they didn't even know what a virus was in those days. They were really working in the dark, and they were dosing everybody with hot whiskey because they had figured out that giving them high doses of aspirin was too dangerous. So really, the safest option was whiskey. So yeah, another thing I suppose relevant to that question of whether boy babies were weaker is I really tried to vary the outcomes for the babies too, and to kind of show that midwives are always focused on the mothers and the babies. But one difference is in 1918 they couldn't have been trying to choose the baby's life over the mother's or anything, because babies were so inherently weak, that really midwives and doctors tended to just focus on trying to save the mother's life so that she might have future babies.
Maybe I could ask you, we've met some of the key characters, and we know there's a question, maybe before we go on, and maybe I'll ask you to read a little bit from the novel. There's a question about the mothers, and this may relate partly to what you were just saying about taking the story from Julia's point of view. So we don't get to know backstory on all the mothers, and they come into the ward and they go out of the ward, and they have their dramas in that moment. Can you tell us a little bit about the variety of mothers that pass through?
Sure. I think a key decision, I mean, the first key decision I made was to set it in a maternity ward. And the second key decision was to make that an inner city hospital where it would be mostly poorer women from the slums. I think that made it more dramatic because there's a bit of a gap there between Julia's, who's fairly middle class and educated, and these women who are, living in a culture where, you're meant to accept it if he beats you. You're meant to keep pumping out the babies. I tried to capture that peculiar pro-natalist attitude in Ireland. So I invented this proverb about, she doesn't love him unless she gives him 12. My own mother from the 50s through to the 60s, she had 8 of us, and that was just a normal Irish family. So I think these women were under pressure from the Catholic Church and the state, and even from sort of working class culture to prove their worth by, having as many babies as possible and basically giving all the food to the children or the man. A lot of these women didn't even sort of sit down at meals. They just sort of had the scraps off the plate at the end of the meal. So of course, a lot of them were coming to a pandemic already weakened, already damaged. One woman who dies in the novel, she comes in ready for this new birth with her one leg still hugely swollen up from the last birth. So I got very interested in how the body of any one of these patients would have a whole kind of political history embedded in it. You could, and Julia, even though she's not officially interested in politics, she can't help but see that, poverty has weakened them, and it's not random whether they live or die. It's very much a matter of, how damaged in advance they are by things that the politicians have allowed to happen. So yeah, of course, I had to be sort of ruthlessly focused. I couldn't follow these women. And so I tried to suggest their backstory in some cases, or suggest what kind of support they had at home, or what kind of house they might be going back to. And one of them in particular, I really don't give any history to, because she's the unmarried mother. And that is such a kind of stereotyped group. And, when she comes into the hospital, I call her Honor White, because I suppose she's the kind of scarlet woman. People would have been so quick to judge her as, either, oh, that one's a poor victim, she got raped, or, oh, that one's a well-known slut who works as a sex worker. And I didn't want them to be able to judge her. So I wanted her to stay to stay stum about it. She refuses to explain or to justify herself. All we know is that she's a strict Catholic. She won't take any pain-killing drugs. She won't take any alcohol. She doesn't explain how she's on her second out of marriage pregnancy. And I suppose a bit like with Julia's mute brother, I wanted her to have a certain strength in her refusal to speak. And I suppose, because I was writing a novel about the making of babies, I didn't want to buy into all the myths about the normal family. So I wanted to show lots of people who don't fit the normal family, from Bridie, who'd grown up in Ireland's kind of mother and baby home to orphanage pipeline, through to this baby who will be born to Honor White. So yeah, of course, it was tantalizing that I didn't get to give the full story of any of these mothers, but as in any medical soap opera, I suppose I tried to evoke them, vividly and fast.
I love what you were saying about the bringing it down to the level of the body, because it's as if that kind of political history is written on the bodies of those women. And there are these global phenomena happen, pandemic, world war, and the rebellion in Ireland. But it comes down to those really, really intimate details that tell us so much about the lives of individual women, and stories that don't normally get told.
Well, like, for instance, there's an autopsy scene in the book, and one reader was critical of that, and she was like, "Oh, why would you, cold-bloodedly show a woman's body being chopped up?" But I was trying to contrast that with the typical quick autopsy scene we see in every detective drama, where you have pretty skinny dead white girl on the slab, and she's shown as this very kind of brief, sexy image of the murdered girl. And I thought, no, I want to have a detailed, slow, thorough session in which the doctor and the nurse are respecting all the different forms of damage that were done to this middle-aged woman's body. They're trying to, kind of decode her, figure out what the flu did, what the endless childbearing did, what the poverty and malnutrition did. So it's a deliberately sort of unsexy autopsy scene in which they take the time and the trouble to try and, interpret what her body is saying to them.
Mm. Maybe I could ask you to read a little bit from the novel, just to give us a taste of it.
Yeah. Here we go. Here's a little bit from the very start, when Julia's getting the tram to work. Here's maybe about 3 minutes of this. The first 2 trams whizzed by, crammed to bursting. More routes must have been cut this week. When the third came, I made myself push onto it. The steps were slippery with carbolic, and my rubber soles could get no purchase. I clung to the stair rail as the tram swayed through the fading darkness and hauled myself upwards. The riders on the balcony section looked soaked through, so I ducked in under the roof, where a long sticker said, "Cover up each cough or sneeze. Fools and traitors spread disease." I was cooling down fast after my bike ride, starting to shiver. Two men on the knifeboard bench moved a little apart so I could wedge myself between them, bag on my lap. Drizzle slanted in on us all. The tram accelerated with the rising whine, passing a line of waiting cabs, but their blinkered horses took no notice. I saw a couple arm in arm below us, hurry through a puddle of lamplight, their bluntly pointed masks like the beaks of unfamiliar birds. Children carrying suitcases were filing into the train station as we swung past, being sent down the country in hopes they would be safe. But from what I could gather, the plague was general all over Ireland. The spectre had a dozen names: the great flu, the khaki flu, the blue flu, the black flu, the grippe or the grip. That word always made me think of a heavy hand landing on one's shoulder and gripping it hard. The malady, some called it euphemistically, or the war sickness, on the assumption that it must somehow be a side effect of 4 years of slaughter, a poison brewed in the trenches, or maybe spread by all this hurly-burly and milling about across the globe. We've got there. We're getting some great questions tonight, Menina. Here's an interesting one from Katrina Tang. You mentioned setting the story in your hometown of Dublin. How much does your home and identity as an Irish Canadian influence your writing? It's one of those questions that would probably be clearer to somebody who studies my work than me. I know that I've sometimes set individual stories in Canada, but I haven't tended to set many of my novels here yet. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I have happened to have been seized by real stories from Ireland and England and America more often. One of my more autobiographical ones, Landing, is about an Irish woman moving to Canada. So I think that's one of the few that's set mostly in Canada. But I think Canada has had a huge effect on my career in basically giving it oxygen, because Ireland is a rather small, intense country. It can be quite inward looking. And I think as long as I lived in Ireland, especially as I had the kind of lesbian label to bear, I'm not suggesting that was such a terrible, terrible stigma. It's more like it was a very specialist identity. So I was always having journalists ring me up and say, "What do Irish lesbians think?" You know. So I think anyone who's from a sort of minority will know that burden of representation. And when I moved to Canada, suddenly, I remember CBC interviewers asking me about, my use of the past tense in a book or something, and I was like, they're not even going to ask about the queer thing. They don't care. So I found that the level of acceptance and inclusion of lesbian and gay and bi people in Canadian life has actually allowed me to really get on with writing my books, whatever they are about. It meant I didn't feel like I was in any sense pigeonholed. So maybe not very obviously at the level of content, but at the level of sort of energy and confidence. I think living in Canada for the last, 22 years has been hugely beneficial. And it's let me feel that I can really sort of write about anything, anytime, anywhere, rather than, making me feel that I'm bound to kind of certain subjects or certain topics or certain identity groups. The loosey-goosey nature of Canadian identity has been brilliant for me. It's let me feel that I could be part of it, and yet that didn't mean I was signing up to any particular list of books I had to write.
There's a question in the chat function asking about what you're reading right now.
Oh, I'm reading a biography of Edison because I stayed in his lodging house in Stratford recently for a getaway. There's a little hotel there called Edison's, and he just struck me as such an interesting weirdo. So I'm currently immersed in a biography of Edison. I try and, read out of my knowledge areas and out of my usual genres quite often. I read popular science quite a lot. And I also like to read books I come across at random, like in those little free libraries. Sometimes I feel a book's been sent to me. And then I get sent lots and lots of fiction by publishers as well. Yeah, quite a mixture of things. But certainly at the very start of the pandemic, I did find historical fiction quite a comfort, because I was already immersed in Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light. And, our state of plague wouldn't have made Thomas Cromwell, turn a hair. His life was so full of, perils. So, a setting like Tudor England can really put our terrors into perspective.
Um, Maybe I could ask you to talk a little bit about. Oh, we were talking about bodies and the connections of the symptoms of the bodies and the attention that you pay to individual bodies. I wondered about bodies and stories. Um, there are so many symptoms that tell stories that are so compelling in the Pole of the Stars. The blood pressure, the heartbeat, the color of the skin that changes depending on how sick someone was. I was actually kind of surprised at how much the story of tracking those life signs becomes the thing that drives the story and the Pole of the Stars.
Well, yeah. For instance, I named the chapters for the colors of somebody with increasingly bad cyanosis, where your tissues are starved of oxygen, and so you start to darken. Um, I suppose as a novelist, you're always looking for ways to turn what might be a lecture into a story. So where statistics might be really useful at the level of lecture, with fiction, you always wanted to be vivid in terms of the senses. So, I mean, one thing I came across was the idea that, certain midwives and nurses, they could sort of smell childbirth fever. They could, the very first hints the woman was brewing an infection after birth, they could smell it. And I was like, oh, Julia will have that. She'll be like taking little sniffs of them. And similarly, as soon as I came across the idea of cyanosis, I was like, oh, it's like a color warning system. That's just what I need. So I suppose I would always tend to go for those just highly concrete examples of things, um, especially when you've got a main character who has all this training that the reader won't have. You don't want it to sound jargony. You're always looking for ways in which it can be, something that a child might see, but the difference is that Julia will know how to interpret that too. So she'll see like a blue nose or ears, and she'll like, oh, cyanosis. I know what that means. Um, yeah, I got such a pleasure and a satisfaction from really immersing myself in the medical work for this book. It's funny because when I was growing up, I probably always thought that I was artsy as opposed to sciencey. That seemed the main distinction. But these days, with science under such explicit attack from, right-wing politics, I feel very passionately pro-science, actually. I feel as if, I may have ended up with my life in the arts, but science, it seems, is not just a neutral thing we all accept now. Science actually needs defending. So in an era of anti-vaccine nonsense, for instance, it seems really worthwhile to have fiction that explicitly celebrates the glories of something like a vaccine in the face of random and horrible death. So yeah, even though the medical stuff was quite hard work with this novel, it was it felt like a hugely meaningful thing to be working on. Oh, I've just spotted an interesting question.
Yeah.
What input did I have into the audiobook? That's an interesting one, Shirley, because usually I wouldn't have that much input, but usually the whole thing is done in a fairly leisurely way. They have time to find the actors, and they send me audio samples of maybe 3 of them. But in this case, because the book was being rushed out, my audiobook publisher said to me, we can't find any Irish actors. Is it okay if we use an American with a brogue? I was like, no, it's not okay. So I basically emailed everyone I knew in Ireland in the arts and said, I need to find an Irish actor with access to either a home studio or near studio. And this was in March, right? So a couple of weeks of negotiations, and then we found the wonderful Emma Lowe. She's actually the sister of one of the producers of Room, and she did the loveliest kind of audio sample, and they managed to find a studio in which she could go in and be directed by someone who was in London, England. So it was all very socially distanced in the middle of March, but I was absolutely thrilled with the results, and she immediately won an award for it. So I thought the novel is so realistic, and having a really precise accent was crucial to it.
There's also a question about the title of the novel.
Yeah, the Pull of the Stars. Very early on, I suppose I came across the where the word influenza comes from. It basically means influence. It's the influence of the stars, and I don't know for sure if this true, but it was said to be a medieval Italian belief that the stars were literally causing these illnesses. They were sort of zapping us, as it were. And I'd always thought of the stars as being considered to influence us in some more macro way at the level of fate or love, but the idea that they would actually give you an illness in some kind of malign cosmic joke. I thought that was a fascinating one. So I thought, well, I'll call it the pull of the stars, like the influence of the stars. But that means I have to have a scene with stars in it. So I thought, okay, where can you see the stars? They'll have to go up on the roof. And so very early on, the title caused me to build in that long scene on the rooftop, where Julia and Bridie finally have a bit of time to themselves. And it was crucial to me to give them and to give everyone a bit of a break from the ward. It's almost like I thought of the reader's experience as rather like birth, that you can have grueling periods and long chapters to match the long shifts in which everything's so like non-stop, all these different women with their different needs. And then it was absolutely crucial to have little tea breaks and one quite long rest before the last chapter, because I was always thinking about the reader's stamina along with Julia's stamina, somebody was asking in the questions about Julia and Bridie, and I don't want to give too much away about it, but I would say that yes, from the very beginning, I was planning for their relationship to be quite transformative, because I was really interested to see, as it were, how much could change in 3 days. It was almost a sort of a test for myself to see if I could just start from scratch and have people get to know each other and have a huge effect on each other's lives all in a couple of days. I always thought of the maternity ward in this book as rather similar to the trenches for men in the war. That it was clearly a space of horror, and yet so many of them looked back on it with nostalgia because of the astonishingly intense bonding with these men for whom they'd risked their lives.
The constellation, the idea of the stars and the cosmos and the sort of the big picture versus, the consistency of the sputum that's on the floor, is evoked also in Julia's watch that she engraves with the moons in a kind of a memorial to the women that she supports.
Yeah, whenever Julia loses a patient, she scratches a little mark on her watch. I suppose I wanted to show her as very, pragmatic and stays in the moment and always on to the next thing, but I didn't want her to seem ruthless. So I liked the idea that, no matter how obscure or poor or, forgotten her patients are, or babies who don't even get named before they're buried, she marks them down, that she has I thought of her as an almost kind of priestess figure, who's actually takes deeply seriously her obligation to try and save these women and these babies, and who doesn't forget any of them. I think any of us who've ever been looked after by a nurse in hospital, we feel kind of a craven gratitude to them that we don't even always feel for the doctors, because we've put ourselves in the position of being like babies in their hands, and we may not know their names or may never see them again, but they have held us, they've got us through. So I was trying to kind of honor the almost sacred nature of that relationship between Julia and these women she'll probably never see again. And one way is to have her, mark it on her watch. Mm-hmm.
There is also a question about Bridie's background in the residential school system in Ireland.
That would be another example of how Canada affects my thinking, because you might say, Ireland has been doing a lot of sort of examination of its basically appalling history of locking up a really high percentage of its population. But I was probably all the more aware of that because in Canada, we've done such a lot of thinking about our appalling history with the residential schools. And I found it a really interesting question. In Canada, we see it so clearly as motivated by racism, like the point of the residential schools was genocidal. But in Ireland, we did a very similar thing, and there was no ethnic difference. It was just really the getting the poor off the streets. A child who was, making music in the street for pennies would be scooped up, and then a judge would send them off to a home. They were basically being punished for being poor there. And because we had so many monks and nuns and brothers, the Catholic orders basically ran a lot of these institutions, which, basically borrowing from the phrase the school to prison pipeline, I decided Bridie would call it the pipe, because there was a whole sort of network of these institutions, from mother and baby homes and Magdalene hospitals where so-called fallen girls would be sent, through to orphanages where not everybody was an orphan. You might well have parents you'd been taken away from, and then industrial schools or reformatories, And these were all in some ways punitive. For instance, the mother and baby homes, the theory was that you could just go there and be looked after for free. But actually, these women had to stay on for 1 year to kind of serve out their time, pay the nuns back for having allowed them to stay during the birth. Or if it was a second birth, they'd have to stay for 2 years because it was a longer sentence. So, there was so much about these institutions that was cruel and appallingly abusive. And it wasn't just specifically nuns or priests. They were generally run by Catholic orders, but often staffed by lay people. And to prepare myself for this book, I made myself read the entire Irish government report. It's called the Ryan Report on abuses in these institutions. And, with each of my novels, there's one research task that I think never again, and I wish I could wipe it from my mind, So reading this detailed testimony by people who'd survived these institutions just turned my stomach. And, for filling in Bridie's background, I only used a handful of anecdotes, some of the milder things, rather than the more, obviously sadistic scenes of beating. I tried to keep, scenes in which, for instance, she'd be, slapped for having red hair because that was the devil's color, like small but inexplicable meannesses like that, or, punished for sneezing, that sort of thing, or for lying in bed in the wrong position. So I think it was probably my background in Canada and in Ireland that gave me that kind of, double fascination with how we can have locked up so many children and done them such harm, all under the pretext of welfare.
I wanted to ask you about the character of Groin.
Poor Groin, what a mean name I gave him. Yeah, one thing I like doing with my narrators is, even if they are basically likable and skillful and competent, there's always some things they'll get wrong. So I like having moments in which they misunderstand or they judge. So I wanted to evoke the war, not just through Julia's brother, who's mute, but the orderlies. I thought it was quite plausible that they would have been off to war as stretcher bearers and they'd be back and damaged in some ways. One of them has a half metal face, for instance. But Groin appears unscathed, and I liked the idea that Julia would dislike him on sight, would hate the fact he's so flippant about death. He's actually, Groin arises out of some notes I was keeping on, witty, indirect ways they referred to death back then. In World War I in particular, they had a lot of kind of, jokey verbs for, to go west or join the heavenly choir, for instance. And so, yeah, Groin was a kind of a set of idioms come to life almost. I thought he'd be very flippant and he would sing lots of songs, and Julia would dislike him instantly, and she would never think to find out about his background or what personal griefs he might have, and Bridie would. So he's almost put in as a little kind of, tripwire for Julia. And I wanted somebody to put the kind of sexist view, for instance, that women shouldn't get the vote. I wanted to suggest some of that tension, that even, women who were not overtly suffragette like Julia, they would still find themselves, rather sparring with men. And so, I think one of the key conversations in the book is when Groin basically says, you shouldn't have the vote because you lot don't serve, you don't serve the king, you don't risk your lives, you don't pay the blood tax. And Julia is like gesturing around at this, ward covered in the bodily fluids of women, and she's like, we pay the blood tax since the dawn of time, So yeah, he's a small but kind of key character.
He sings as well, doesn't he?
He does, yes. Lots of real songs ended up in this book. I've been doing that ever since my novel Frog Music. I think because that was about performers, I started bringing in lots of sort of, burlesque songs of the 1870s and songs of the time. And then I realized from reading a lot about it that people back then used to just sort of sing in the street. People were not inhibited about leaving music to the professionals. For instance, if a new song came out, people would buy the sheet music in the street and sing it themselves. There was a feeling that music was something everybody did, the way we might feel about, say, conversation today, that you didn't have to leave it to the professionals. So since then, I've always found that, allowing the songs of the day to kind of just trickle in, a bit like those background posters. It's a lovely way to sort of suggest the concerns of popular culture. So, for instance, in The Pull of the Stars, you've got some overtly pro-war songs, recruiting songs, and you've got one drunk at a bus stop singing a song called "I Don't Want to Be a Bloody Soldier." So instead of staging some argument in which whether or not to enlist was overtly discussed, it's fun to do it, a bit more lightly by just, echoing a few song lyrics.
I remember building a playlist when I was reading Slammerkin for music.
Interesting.
I noticed you've got a playlist up for The Pull of the Stars, which I wasn't aware of. I wish I'd known about it before I read the novel.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, here's a good question from Mary Curran. You mentioned getting advice from a midwife in present day Hamilton. Do you have a sense how different midwifery was in 1918 than it is now? It's a very good question. Midwifery is an interesting mixture in that there's that ancient tradition of, uneducated, but of course, steeped in the tradition of midwifery, women helping you, and as opposed to hospitals. But then you'd also get somebody like Julia Power, who was a trained nurse and qualified in midwifery as well. And so what I was always trying to do was suggest that she is part of this sort of longer tradition of more, you know, oral tradition. For instance, something you don't get in any of the books about midwifery from, say, the 1910s, you don't get any mention of counter pressure. But when I was giving birth, I found the midwives were so expert at, showing Chris just where to push on my back to really reduce the pain. So I tried to suggest that Julia had a lot of those skills, as well as the ones that the doctors would have put in the books, that she's as it were got the best of those two traditions. But to answer the question about how different it was now, one obvious difference is that nowadays there's far more of an emphasis on empowering the woman who's giving birth. So basically, whatever she wants, if she wants to run around and eat chocolate ice cream, nobody's going to stop her. In those days, there was a lot more of, now get into position, missus. And, the positions, for instance, were tended to be specified according to what country you were in. I mean, literally, the Germans, okay, I'm forgetting the details here, but it was something like the Germans had you lying on the left and the British had you lying on your right side, showing that these are not nature's laws. These are very particular societal laws. But I would say birth in the 1910s, it wasn't as bad as it got later when it was thoroughly medicalized. I mean, by maybe 1950s in America, my sense is that, for instance, you'd be shaved before birth and you might be snipped in advance and so on. In 1910s Ireland, they were still pretty much leaving it to nature, but there was quite a lot of, emphasis on lying the woman down when the moment came for the doctor to deliver her. That was how they would say it. Not that she would deliver, but I will come along and deliver Mrs. Donoghue, And I tried to suggest that tension at moments when Julia, a doctor will dash in and sort of say, oh, that patient is failing to get the baby out. Well, I'll come back and do an operation. Something I added at the last minute was I'd become aware that in Ireland, they routinely did this appalling operation where they would sort of unhinge the woman's pelvis. And this basically allowed her to keep having babies year after year. And I didn't want to include this horrifying operation in my book, but I wanted to be honest about the fact that it happened all the time. So I thought I'll have a doctor come in and say, oh, she'll need one of those operations. I'll just go get my chainsaw. I'm serious. They had little hand cranked chainsaws they used for this. And then, with advice from Dr. Lynn, Julia manages to help the woman get the baby out before it comes to that. So yes, and there were certainly details that my modern midwife was just, goggle-eyed at and horrified by some of the things they didn't know back then. But she was very helpful too on sort of advising me on what the woman who's giving birth might actually be feeling at each point.
There's also a question here about, given that you're interested in science and reading about popular science, have you ever thought about writing science fiction?
I think I tried once for about a page, and it just wasn't working. Oh, no, there's an exception. I have one short story out this year set in 40 years' time, and it's about a world in which nobody's having babies at all anymore. I was interested in taking, modern tendencies are to have fewer and fewer babies, and I think it is a habit we could easily lose. It's not a convenient thing to make babies in any sense. It's never a convenient time in any individual life, and I think it is a habit we could lose. So that was a speculative exercise in the form of a long short story. But it still reads quite, like our society with just one thing different. I think I would have trouble creating an entirely different world. And I noticed similarly, I enjoy reading fantasy, but I've never written it. I seem to need to keep myself rooted in what feels like realism, even if it's from previous eras, which you might say are as far away from me as a fantasy world would be. But but I can kind of trust that I'm getting them right if I've done the work. So yeah, I just don't seem drawn to invented worlds, you know.
Could I maybe ask you to read a little bit more? And
Sure,
then we'll turn to some of the questions from the chat and from the Q&A.
sure. Here's a little bit from later in the novel. A little tea break when Mary O'Reilly, who's a very young mother who's came in so ignorant that she asked Julia when her belly button would be opening for the baby to come out, and Julia had to break it to her that it was not coming out that way. That's one of those many details you might think I've made up, but not a bit. That was some anecdote from, I think, 1940s Dublin. I was a mother who didn't know where the baby was coming out. So yeah, here's a rare sort of quiet moment in the ward. I made tea all round. Delia Garrett wanted 3 biscuits, which I took as a sign of life. When Bridie returned, she slurped her tea and sighed. Lovely. I sipped mine and tried to appreciate the flavour of wood chip and ash. It's really not lovely, Bridie, I said. Before the war, people would have spat this stuff out. Well, but you brewed it fresh for us, she pointed out, and 3 sugars. I wondered how many spoonfuls the boarders at her mother house convent were allowed, 1 each. And a biscuit, she said. You're a tonic, Bridie, I said. You're just what the doctor ordered. Have another biscuit if you like. You must be half dead. She grinned. Not even 1% dead, remember? I stand corrected, I said. We are all of us 100% alive. I drank my tea down, thinking, dust of the Indies. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Mary O'Reilly had dropped off. I went over, rescued her baby from the crook of the mother's elbow and set her in the crib. Bridie murmured, like the story. Which story? I asked. About the mother who comes back. From where? I asked. You know, Julia, the other side, she said. I finally got it. She's dead, this mother in the story. Bridie nodded. The babby won't stop crying in the story, so the mammy comes all the way back from the other side to nurse it. I knew some ghost stories, but not that one. I watched the O'Reilly baby. I wondered how long had the spectral mother in the story stayed with her child. Not for good. That wouldn't be allowed. Maybe all night, though. Maybe till cockcrow. I'll leave that there. I do apologize for this being such a sad book, by the way. I often feel quite mean to my readers. All I can say is I have a strong kind of instinct of what needs to happen, and I need to serve that, even though I know I'm causing you personal distress. So
that actually was a question that I had, that I thought about asking, was how do you negotiate telling such difficult, sad, often, I mean, in the moment, there's often hopelessness stories. And how do you kind of find a balance in the story? I mean, in this case, you have birth and you have death, and they're often right in the same room next to one another.
Yeah, it's funny. I do give some thought to what my readers are going through and what they will want and like. I'm not indifferent to that. I quite often think about which things would be unbearable to my readers, for instance. For instance, I would never have written a story like Room and then have the escape attempt fail and have them locked up again at the end. I wouldn't see any point in that. It would feel like a dead end. So I think a lot about, my readers and ways of, in a way, compensating them for their trouble. They're literally investing their concentration and their energy. And I know that my readers are not typically, spending the entire day at the cottage getting to read under perfect circumstances. They're finding moments in their busy day and often at the end of their busy day for my book. And so I want them to be clear about what's going on. For instance, I don't write deliberately difficult books. And I want them to feel, rewarded or comforted, but equally I want them to feel gripped. And so I put them through a lot of dark stuff. And sometimes in the case of, Who Lives and Who Dies, I'm just following a very instinctive sense of what's right in the pattern, what fits, like tracing a pattern in a carpet. So it's not like I'm thinking, oh, will my readers all want this baby to survive? It's more like I feel, oh, that has to happen there because it's the right shape. I don't feel I'm being very articulate about this. And then, given that something sad is going to happen, I think, okay, I'll then give my readers a bit of a break, or I'll, ease things off or use a bit of humor there or bring in a moment's sweetness there. So I might tinker with the tone, But at the level of what happens, I'm just trying to make a pleasing shape. And the thing about writing fiction is if you put in enough um, little hints of something in advance, even if the reader doesn't consciously add them all up, when the thing happens at the end, it'll sort of click into place. It's almost like a rhyme. You know, if you've set up the pattern in advance, it feels inevitable. It feels well shaped. Is all I can say. But I do quite often feel bad too. But you know, it's funny that when I get complaining emails from readers, it's quite often because I've put in a happy ending. A couple of times readers have written to me and said, I loved your book until suddenly a totally improbable thing happened at the end. So readers are not all in agreement about what feels right to them.
Well, and to be fair, that it's a bleak story, but there's a lot of hopefulness in it. And there is, it's punctuated with moments of hope, and there's an arc of hope to the story that's really redeeming, without getting into any of the details of how the narrative develops.
Well, one thing I found, Menina, was that if you're setting a book, on a lovely island resort or, a nice family Christmas or something, you need conflict. You're going to have people fighting over the turkey fairly quickly, or else it's a bland, sentimental story. But if you're setting a novel in a flu ward, you can actually have people behave very decently. Bridie is really immediately helpful. Julia's, once she gets over her slight crankiness at the start when Bridie breaks a thermometer by boiling it, she's pretty nice to her too. The doctor's pretty nice. The women are all pretty kind to each other because, death is stalking the room. And there's already an enemy. There's already a conflict. So you can actually have people behave pretty graciously to each other. So that's one kind of tiny compensation, is that moment by moment, there's a huge amount of kind of tact being shown. Even like if one of the women is in the middle of giving birth, the other women just sort of naturally turn their heads away to try and give her a little bit of privacy. So at the level of human interaction, you can create quite a lot of sweetness, so long as there are going to be some horrible losses. And I did try and get that balance right. This is a pandemic, so it had to feel real. There had to be moments of absolute heartbreak, or frankly, I wouldn't be being true to the fact that so many people lost a loved one in that pandemic and in all pandemics.
Well, there's also, with historical fiction, the feeling that I know when I was reading this at the height of the pandemic, that this happened and they got past it, and history unfolded past this moment. And in some ways, I found that really, really reassuring when reading this in the middle of a pandemic.
I'm so glad. Here's an interesting question from Victoria Burnett about whether Julia, for much of the book, seems asexual. That would be an example of how, when you're writing historical fiction, you're wonderfully freed from the labels of today. One thing I like about writing about the past is that they didn't label things to do with, say, human sexuality so much. So you can just describe the feelings as they arrive and describe the person's reactions to those feelings, but they don't have to have an identity label. We're a very labeling era. And I really don't think in 1918 people were, even if concepts like, homosexual or heterosexual or even bisexual were around, I don't think everybody was ticking a box. I think, a woman might ask herself a very concrete question like, do I want to get married and have children? But if she didn't, I think it was possible to live in a kind of a, career girl zone or a spinster zone, or a, wait and see, sure, I'm only 29 kind of zone. I don't think people were labeled in the same way. And when you go back even farther, that's even more true. So, for instance, my novel Life Mask is set in the 1780s and 1790s. And one of my characters is Horace Walpole, who nowadays we would probably think of as, very obviously screaming queen gay man of the 18th century. But in his later years, he got besotted with this young woman, Mary Berry. And so, I really enjoyed writing this very kind of, theatrical, over the top, playful, effeminate, scholarly man who was really in many ways madly in love with this young woman. And that was a very unlabeled kind of relationship, and I thoroughly enjoyed being able to get into the nitty gritties of it without having to sort of decide what category he was in, you know. So yeah, even though it might seem like historical fiction focuses a lot on sort of what people wore and what their food was and so on, actually mostly what we're trying to get right is the psychology of the times. And I think in Julia's day there was a huge emphasis on, you know, just get on with your work. You know, their stamina was amazing. That sort of, you know, keep calm and carry on kind of mentality, and the kind of dark humor of, you know, oh, things have got a little bit dicey, the bombs are falling, but we press on, you know. And you might say they hid their feelings compared with us, but they were also wonderfully tough compared with us.
And Julia is during the course of the 3 days of the novel, has her 30th birthday. So she is at that kind of crucial point where she's deciding what she is the next step for her, or what choices she makes.
And above all, she's madly busy. It's I really I like I like writing novels about women in which they're not thinking about their relationships all the time, because, you know, that's traditionally been the focus for women, is, you know, oh, sort of forget about your job, but tell us about your love life. So I really like taking women's jobs seriously in books like this. And of course, you know, their relationships matter too, but in a way they happen more slightly off to one side, because the women have found work to do that is meaningful, even if it's not very well paid. And I really try and sort of honor that choice by making the focus be on the work. And I also like the fact that, you know, love could kind of sneak up on you while you're working so hard, because it wasn't something you thought to either look out for or to ward off, you know, because the focus was on the work.
Here's a great question. From your research, what was the largest takeaway that you could use in handling and proceeding through the current pandemic?
Hmm. Well, yeah, I think that the biggest thing that came out for me was the notion that I probably went into writing this book thinking, oh, a pandemic, such a fascinating leveler, death could kill anyone. But of course, once I started looking at the actual nitty gritties of life, say in the Dublin slums, I realized that if women were coming into this ward already so, you know, weakened, lack of calcium, you know, their teeth falling out, um, um, you know, many systems in their body under strain from lack of food, from too much work, from too much childbirth. You know, of course they would be hit much harder by this apparently random virus than if they were rich and pampered. And in particular, I found myself resenting so many of those bits of government advice about, you know, lie down and have yourself nursed for 2 weeks. You know, just the complete ignoring of the realities of the lives of the poor. And so this year, I find that the headlines I've really been noticing are those ones that remind me of 1918, in that, you know, it's just ignoring the realities of families who live several family to an apartment, or, you know, have to, you know, share a lift with everybody else in their building, or have to go out to work, or have to be in situations where, you know, working in a restaurant and the customers aren't wearing their masks. You know, I'm so aware of the politics of the pandemic, partly because I paid close attention to this other pandemic 100 years ago. So then, I suppose when the Black Lives Matter protest took on such an amazing kind of, you know, global reach this summer, I thought that was so interesting. It wasn't at all the obvious effect you would have expected the COVID pandemic to have, but it's as if at a moment like this, we realize the status quo is not, you know, is not either obvious or permanent. We realize that it's just one set of social arrangements, and it's as if we all had enough time to actually do some thinking about the realities of our society. And, you know, that's been such an interesting takeaway for me this year. So I'm really glad that my novel focused so much on the lives of Julia's poorer patients, because I think it makes it a much more interesting story than if it was just truly random living and dying, and, you know, the luck of the stars, as it were. I suppose I'm saying that, you know, it's not really the stars that decide who lives and dies. It's probably our votes and budgets and, you know, realities like that. And that to blame it on the stars or God's will, you know, that's really avoiding the fact that we vote for these outcomes. These are great questions we're getting, aren't
They
they?
are.
This is like some in-depth seminar. It's fantastic. Like nobody said, where do you get your ideas? I'm deeply grateful. Oh, Anna Connell wants to know, was The Wonder going to be turned into a film? Glad you asked. Yes. I can't announce dates yet, but I would say I have half a dozen film or TV projects which I've taken on since Room, some of them adapting other people's books, some of them adapting my own. And I would say The Wonder is closer to actually being filmed than anything else. Obviously, everything still depends on COVID, but it has got fairly close. And again, I really enjoyed the experience of adapting that. So fingers crossed for that one. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask what you're working on now aside from those adaptations.
Strangely enough, Menina, I'm trying to write a musical. I'm collaborating with a composer, collaborating on the lyrics and the composer doing the music and me doing the book. It's a totally new form for me, and I feel like a complete beginner, which is it's a state of mind that's very good for creation. I find you don't want to get smug or rest on your laurels, So I would say since publishing Room in particular, I felt the need to try new things so that I don't, sit around going, I wrote a bestseller. So writing the film of Room made me feel like an idiot in a good way. Writing children's books had the same effect, that beginner mind that the Buddhists talk about. And now writing a musical, it's very similar. What am I doing? But I'm so enjoying it.
Did you have much to do with the musical elements of the adaptation of Room for the stage?
No, I didn't write the songs in any sense, but I suppose probably that was my gateway drug, in that when our director, Cora Bissett, suggested adding songs to the story of Room, I would not have seen that coming. But she very quickly persuaded me that in the case of Room, the songs might really work as a kind of intense release valve for all the secrets that Ma can't share with Jack. So the songs serve a very particular purpose in that story, and it worked so well that I've been asked since, would I license versions of the play with the songs taken out? And I said, no, you can't do it. The songs are crucial in the story now. So yeah, that probably made me think more about plays with songs, and even plays that are not labeled as musicals. The songs are crucial in them. I'm thinking of something like the Penelopiad, which I saw the Grand last year. So even if a theatre piece is not specifically labeled as being a play with songs, the songs are often a crucial part of it. So yeah, that probably sort of opened my eyes to the musical as a form. And also our 13-year-old is so into musicals, and I watched lots of them with her and so on. So that's helped too. Our kids have had an influence on everything I've written in the last 17 years.
Will the play of Room be remounted?
It is fervently hoped and planned. Yes, absolutely. It should come back to Canada. Oh, I see. Kirsten Smith wants to know, do I have my character's main story arcs plotted out before I started? Yeah, I'm a huge planner, and I don't think this takes the fun out of it at all, because things can change. As we saw with Dr. Lynn, I was trying to keep her politics well out of it, but they surged in. So there's always room for change. In Slammerkin, for instance, I tried to represent a very realistic 18th century household, including a manservant. And before I knew it, my main character and the manservant were kind of flirting with each other, and I had not intended that in any way, but I couldn't stop them. So I did a further draft in which they had a brief doomed love affair. So there's always room for variation, but I find if you don't plan, it's likely to be wobbly. A book really needs a structure. You might be able to write a short story just on impulse, but a book is a big thing, and I certainly find I can't do that kind of shaping just on the hoof as I go along. I need to have decided in advance what the main things are that will happen. Yeah.
What does the shaping look like? Do you draw pictures, storyboard?
No, and it's not notes stuck on a board. I use a program called Scrivener, so I gather little files on everything, but then I start to group them into chapter 1, chapter 2, and I write out what's going to happen in each chapter, and in particular what new things the reader learns. Because if I find I'm, giving away lots of secrets in a row in chapter 3, I might be like, okay, let's put one of those in chapter 1. So I sort of move the plot points around. And nowadays I plan more and more. I would say I spend years on end really deciding, how much the story should cover and who the point of view should be and what will happen where. And so, how it varies tends to be relatively subtle, like something like letting Dr. Lynn talk about her politics more, but the kind of basic story points will have been decided in advance. And some writers don't need to do this, but I definitely do. I don't think I'm naturally very good at plots, so I need to very consciously mull over and shape the plots to try and, strip them down to their leanest. If I could have done 4 days for this book, but if I didn't need four, why include four? If you can get it down to three, so much the better.
Okay. I'm going to maybe ask one more question.
Hmm.
And I'm choosing among all my Post-it notes that I have surrounding my screen. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're taking from the Pull of the Stars into your next project. Are you thinking like of continuing to write historical fiction?
I have about 6 books lined up, and they won't all make it. Some books stay endlessly in my queue as other books jump the queue. But what I can tell you is that for a long time now, they've kind of toggled between historical and contemporary settings. I would say maybe either half or sometimes 2/3 of my ideas that I get obsessively interested in are historical, but contemporary ones always arise again. So I try to just alternate these a bit so that I don't have, a long run of one kind or another. And I would say, strangely enough, I don't seem to be writing short stories much anymore, apart from the recent one about the world with no babies. It's as if, because I'm doing so much writing for film and TV, I seem to kind of naturally go between my fiction writing, and then screenwriting has become my other thing, where short stories used to be my kind of break from the novel. I would say it's not that I have difficulty writing, but I certainly need little breaks, and I sometimes, for no good reason, will suddenly let myself wander off for a couple of days and research a future possible book when I'm meant to be working hard on this one. It's as if I need to play hooky sometimes, and instead of just not writing, what I do is I go write something else or make plans for some future writing. So it's a way of sort of allowing the brain a lot of small freedoms, while knowing that still ultimately I'll get the book written. You don't want it to feel too much like a day job,
Right.
even if in fact you do it all day, 7 days a week.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of our time.
These were superb questions, really. I don't always
Yeah,
get such detailed questions. They're amazing.
Thank you to everybody who put in questions and who talked in the comments. Our moderator has reminded us that you can get any of Emma's books through the link to the bookstore. And that just leaves it to me to thank Emma very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to hear about your past work and what's coming up in the future. So I'll just say, stay safe, everybody. And thank you, Emma.
It's been a treat. Thank you all. Bye, Menina. Thank you.
Bye.